As we've already discussed, ancient Egypt was a civilization dedicated to permanence, religion, and an unchanging, ageless order. It seems the most rigidly conservative civilization that ever existed, yet close study reveals that ancient Egypt had more shifts, changes, and developments than any primitive prehistoric culture. However, we're not going to get into all the details of that. We're mostly going to look at the fact that ancient Egypt retained stability by keeping certain symbols consistent of the ruling class, no matter who was in power. Recording their history in terms of various dynasties of their rulers, the Egyptians signified their long sense of continuity and overwhelming importance given to the pharaoh, or king. He is not merely a ruler, but also a god. The Egyptian belief that in the absolute divinity of the ruler gave their art and storytelling ritual from its formal hierarchical character. There's a sophisticated sense of abstraction, and when we look at the artwork of the time period, we see this sort of stiff, formal method of communicating power and that continuity that we've been talking about. We're looking at two figures, a pharaoh and his wife, standing side by side, gazing into eternity. He represents the epitome of kingship and the ideal human male form. She is the ideal female. He wears the nemes on his hand, which is this certain kind of headdress, a long artificial beard, which were strapped onto the face, and a wraparound kilt with a central tab, all which identify him as a king. In his hand, he clasped what may be abbreviated forms of the symbols of his office. His high cheekbones, bulbous nose, slight furrows running diagonally from his nose to the corners of his mouth and lower lip thrust out into a slight pout. They may be seen on her as well, although her face has a feminine fleshiness which his lacks. Traces of red paint remain on his face, and black paint on her wig. His broad shoulders, taut torso, and muscular arms and legs, all modeled with subtlety, restraint, convey a latent strength. In contrast, her narrow shoulders and slim body, whose contours are apparent under her tight-fitting sheath dress, represent the Egyptian ideal of femininity. As is standard for sculptures of Egyptian men, his left foot is advanced, although all of his weight seems to remain on the right foot. Typically, Egyptian females are shown with both feet together, but here the left foot is shown slightly forward. Although they stand together sharing a common base and a back slab, she embraces him, and they remain aloof and share no emotion, either with the viewer or with each other. So one of the other forms of Egyptian art we're going to look at is the relief. Here I've put the Mesopotamian relief right next to the Egyptian relief so you can see the contrast. There are certain time periods of Egyptian art where this formal, rigid method of communication is broken, specifically the Armenian period, which was King Tut's father. But we're not really going to get into that since it's such an exception to the rule. But for the most part, what you can see here is the Mesopotamian relief, how things are more rounded and cylindrical, as we've been talking about, versus this sort of rigid body posture, way of holding the arms, mixed with the hieroglyphics. And there's just really specific visual signifiers for what the artwork is trying to say. So there were strict style guidelines in Egypt. Specifically, there's a precise measurement and a relationship to the ground line. There was also specific placement and proportion based on their system of measurement. People were also smaller or larger based on their importance. So here you're seeing servants in a smaller scale compared to the pharaoh and his wife here at a larger scale. Scale is extremely important in Egyptian art, as we're going to continue to talk about both in costume and in architecture. We also are looking at a conventional pose of Egyptian people. The shoulders are faced towards the front. The head and legs are facing towards the right or the left. And their clothing is shown frontally while their legs face to one side. Because of their religious beliefs about death, domestic dwellings were made of more perishable materials. Here we see a reconstruction of a mud brick a domestic dwelling. There would have been a roof on this, but you can also see that it is built in such a way that the top part of the wall would allow for air to move through the building. By contrast, tombs, temples, and statues were all made from imperishable stone, which is why we still have evidence of what they are today. And specifically pyramids, which of course we know the most about, so therefore I'm not really going to talk about them as much. We know that they were tombs, that they have multiple interior pathways, locations, and tombs within them, and that they are a part of a larger tomb site, sometimes with multiple pyramids of different sizes and other structures. It took a long time to build these, so usually there was an entire sort of palace structure connected or other dwellings nearby to the pyramids. The pyramids themselves represented society and the fact that death and afterlife were at the forefront of the way that society functioned. Pyramids were, of course, filled with personal possessions, paintings of daily life, and even images of what private housing might have looked like, although we don't have a ton of information about what the day-to-day housing situation was for most people. There were also models of useful objects that people could use in the afterlife. Clothing, so I'm going to talk about clothing for a little bit here. Clothing was simple. Few garments had seams. The quality and amount designated status, just like we see in other ancient cultures. However, poor people did not wear dramatically different kinds of clothing. Here on this statue, we see how there's a pattern of fine lines following the shape of the drapery. This was due to how easily linen pleats, and it would be pleated in a very specific way. Pleating makes a fabric heavier, and so therefore it clings to the body a little more. So as you see some of these atypical Egyptian artworks from the time period I was talking about, you can really sort of see how they're breaking that rigid formality, but you're also sort of getting a better sense of how the fabric sort of swirls around her body and hangs off his. It would have been woven to have a thin, transparent texture to see the body as if through a veil. And in the Old Kingdom, here's the picture of seeing the body as if through a veil. So this is the exterior of the Cairo Museum of Egyptian Antiquities, and the exterior was built in 1902. So this was very much looking backwards in a sort of romantic style towards Egyptian clothing. But this is sort of the idea that the fabric clings to the body as much as possible. Now, would it cling as much as this artist is representing it? Probably not. But that is a updated version of the ideals of the costume for the period. Costume also changes just the same way it did in Mesopotamia over time. Clothing starts really, really simple with things like loincloths, collars, headdresses, long skirts, to the Middle Kingdom, where we have more variation of loincloths and a version of a shirt, to the New Kingdom, where things get more complicated and layered with long sleeve tunics, robes for ceremonial occasions, girdles and collars over tunics, and often one tunic over another. We see always this tension in Egyptian art, that life reflects art more than it actually reflects life itself. So the costume is always a slight bit of extrapolation from what we know the style and the ideals to be versus what the fabrics may have actually done in the time period. The next part that you are going to, the next item that you're going to watch is a video about how linen is made in the modern day. You can imagine that this is much more difficult without the machinery that you're going to see. There's also several other videos that you will see in a line before you get to another lecture.